What if I told you that compassion, the very quality we are taught to revere as the pinnacle of human virtue, is often nothing more than the most seductive chain we've ever willingly forged? What if the warmth you felt in acts of kindness, the swelling pride in selfless giving, and the elaborate justifications for endless patience are not signs of moral evolution, but the golden shackles that keep your authentic power forever out of reach? Tonight we venture into territory so forbidden that even questioning it feels like blasphemy. We will dissect compassion itself, not as the beautiful virtue you've been conditioned to worship, but as the sophisticated control mechanism that transforms your natural strength into voluntary servitude. Over the next hour, you will confront truths that will shake the foundation of everything you believe about goodness, virtue, and what it means to be a moral human being. You will discover how your compassion has been weaponized against you, how your empathy has become your prison, and how your desire to help others has been transmuted into a compulsion that serves everyone's interests except your own. This is not a comfortable journey. We will explore why society needs you to be compassionate, why your compassion often enables rather than helps, and why the most compassionate people often live the most limited, frustrated, and ultimately powerless lives. By the end of this exploration, you may discover that what you thought was your greatest virtue has actually been your most elegant prison, and that true freedom requires something far more dangerous than compassion: the courage to be authentically selfish when selfishness serves your highest development. Let's begin by examining how compassion seduces you with promises that it rarely delivers. Compassion doesn't just ask you to help others, it promises that helping others will make you a better person, that your sacrifice will be spiritually rewarded, that your selflessness will ultimately serve your own highest good. This promise is intoxicating because it seems to solve the fundamental tension between self-interest and moral virtue. You can pursue your own psychological needs for meaning, purpose, validation, and moral superiority, while appearing to serve others' needs. You get to feel good about yourself, while calling it goodness, rather than self-service. But examine what actually happens when you organize your life around compassion. You begin measuring your worth by how much you sacrifice for others, rather than by what you create, achieve, or become. Your identity becomes dependent on others' problems existing for you to solve. Your sense of purpose relies on others' neediness for you to address. This creates a perverse psychological dynamic where you become emotionally invested in others, remaining weak, needy, and dependent because their strength would eliminate your source of meaning and identity. The compassionate person needs others to suffer so they can feel valuable through alleviating that suffering. Consider the parent whose entire identity revolves around being needed by their children. When the children become independent, the parent doesn't celebrate their success. They feel useless, empty, without purpose. The compassionate parent has become psychologically dependent on their children's dependence. The same pattern appears in friendships, where one person always plays the helper and the other always needs help. The helper doesn't actually want their friend to solve their problems permanently, because that would end the relationship dynamic that makes the helper feel important and valuable. In romantic relationships, the compassionate partner often chooses people who need fixing, saving, or constant emotional support. They don't choose partners who are already whole and capable, because such partners wouldn't provide the opportunities for compassionate service that the helper requires to feel good about themselves. This reveals that much of what we call compassion is actually a sophisticated form of emotional consumption. The compassionate person consumes the good feelings that come from helping others while telling themselves they're being selfless. They're not sacrificing for others. They're feeding their own psychological needs through others' problems. The compassion addict becomes as dependent on opportunities to help as any other addict is dependent on their substance of choice. They seek out people who need help, situations that require sacrifice, causes that demand their involvement. When deprived of these opportunities, they experience withdrawal in the form of purposelessness, worthlessness, and identity crisis. This addiction is socially encouraged because it produces people who are useful to others while feeling virtuous about their usefulness. The compassionate person doesn't ask for fair compensation for their help, doesn't require reciprocity in their relationships, and doesn't prioritize their own development over others' immediate needs. Society gets an endless supply of willing servants who feel good about serving, who don't demand much in return, and who will sacrifice their own potential to maintain the comfort and stability of others. These compassionate people become the emotional and practical infrastructure that holds together families, organizations, and communities, often at great personal cost to themselves. But the most insidious aspect of compassion addiction is how it makes people complicit in their own limitation. They don't see their helping as servitude. They see it as virtue. They don't recognize their sacrifice as self-betrayal. They experience it as moral elevation. They don't understand that their compassion is often enabling others' dysfunction while preventing their own growth. The compassionate person becomes trapped in what psychologists call a helper complex, a condition where their identity and self-worth become so intertwined with helping others that they lose touch with their own needs, desires, and potential. They know how to be useful to others, but don't know how to be valuable in their own right. The true cost of compassion addiction is rarely calculated because society teaches us to measure only the apparent benefits, the problems solved, the people helped, the suffering alleviated. But every act of compulsive compassion extracts a price from the giver that is often far greater than the benefit provided to the receiver. The first cost is time, not just the hours spent helping others, but the opportunity cost of what you could have created, learned, or achieved if you had invested that time in your own development. The compassionate person spends their evenings counseling friends through relationship dramas instead of developing skills that could advance their career. They spend their weekends doing favors for family members instead of pursuing interests that could enrich their own life. Over years and decades, this time investment creates a dramatic divergence in life outcomes. While the compassionate person remains stuck in the same patterns of serving others, less compassionate people who invest their time in their own development, advance in their careers, develop new capabilities, create wealth, build networks, and achieve goals that were also available to the helper, but not pursued, because helping others took priority. The second cost is energy, physical, emotional, and mental energy that gets drained by constantly managing others' problems and emotions. Compassion addiction creates what therapists call emotional exhaustion, a state where your capacity for feeling becomes depleted by constantly processing others' feelings rather than your own. This exhaustion manifests as chronic fatigue, difficulty concentrating, loss of enthusiasm for your own interests, and a general sense of emptiness that no amount of helping others can fill. The compassionate person often feels drained at the end of each day, not because they've done physically demanding work, but because they've spent their emotional resources on others rather than investing them in their own goals and satisfaction. The third cost is identity erosion. When your sense of self becomes entirely dependent on your role as a helper, you lose touch with your authentic preferences, desires, and personality traits that exist independent of others' needs. You know how to be a good friend, supportive partner, helpful colleague, and caring family member, but you don't know who you are when no one needs anything from you. This identity erosion creates what psychologists call empty self syndrome, a condition where your personality becomes a collection of adaptive responses to others' needs, rather than an expression of your authentic nature. You become skilled at reading what others want from you and providing it, but you lose the ability to know what you want for yourself. The fourth cost is relationship dysfunction. Ironically, people who organize their lives around helping others often end up with unsatisfying relationships because their relationships become based on utility rather than mutual attraction and respect. Others learn to see them as resources to be used rather than people to be valued. The compassionate person attracts people who need help rather than people who offer mutual enhancement. Their social circle becomes populated with individuals who bring problems rather than solutions, who drain energy rather than provide it, who take more than they give. The helper becomes surrounded by takers, not because they're unlucky, but because their helper identity attracts people who need helping. These relationships often lack genuine intimacy because they're based on functional roles rather than authentic connection. The helper knows how to care for others, but doesn't know how to allow others to care for them. They know how to give, but don't know how to receive. They know how to be useful, but don't know how to be simply valued for who they are rather than what they provide. The fifth cost is resentment, a deep, often unconscious anger that builds over time when helping others doesn't produce the rewards that were promised. The compassionate person was told that their sacrifice would be spiritually rewarding, that their kindness would be returned, that their service would create gratitude and love. When these rewards don't materialize, when the people they help don't become grateful, when their sacrifice isn't reciprocated, when their service isn't appreciated, the helper begins to feel used, unappreciated, and angry. But because their identity is built on being compassionate, they can't acknowledge this anger directly. Instead, it manifests as passive aggression, martyrdom, and subtle manipulation of others through guilt. The sixth cost is stunted personal development. The person who spends their life focusing on others' growth never develops their own potential. They remain psychologically frozen at whatever stage they were at when they began their pattern of compulsive helping, because helping others becomes a substitute for doing their own developmental work. While their friends, family, and community members grow, change, and evolve through facing their own challenges, the helper remains stuck because they've made themselves indispensable to others' growth while neglecting their own. They become increasingly out of step with their peers, who have continued developing while they remained focused on maintenance and rescue rather than personal advancement. The seventh cost is powerlessness. Despite appearing to be the strong one who helps others, the compassionate person often feels fundamentally powerless in their own life. They can solve everyone else's problems but feel unable to create positive change in their own circumstances. They can counsel others through challenges but feel stuck in their own patterns. This powerlessness develops because helping others becomes a substitute for building genuine capabilities. The helper becomes skilled at managing others' lives, but never develops the skills needed to create the life they want for themselves. They can fix others' relationships, but can't create satisfying relationships for themselves. They can help others achieve their goals, but don't know how to pursue their own aspirations effectively. The final cost is what we might call compassion fatigue, a state where the capacity for caring becomes depleted through overuse. The person who has given so much to so many for so long eventually reaches a point where they feel nothing, no empathy, no desire to help, no satisfaction from service. They've burned out their natural capacity for caring through compulsive overuse. This fatigue often creates a crisis where the helper realizes that their life has been devoted to others while their own potential has remained undeveloped. They may feel that they've wasted their life, that they've been taken advantage of, that their sacrifice has been meaningless. But by this point, their identity and relationships are so built around helping that changing course feels impossible. Perhaps the most disturbing truth about compassion addiction is that it often achieves the opposite of its stated intention. Instead of helping others become stronger, more capable, and more independent, compulsive compassion frequently keeps others weak, dependent, and unable to develop their own problem-solving capabilities. This occurs through what therapists call enabling, providing help in ways that remove natural consequences and prevent others from developing resilience, self-reliance, and personal responsibility. The enabler believes they're being kind by solving others' problems, but they're actually preventing others from learning to solve problems themselves. Consider the parent who consistently rescues their adult child from the consequences of poor financial decisions. Each time the child makes irresponsible purchases, fails to pay bills, or loses jobs due to poor performance, the parent provides money to prevent eviction, repossession, or other natural consequences. The parent believes they're being loving and compassionate, but they're actually teaching their child that someone else will always handle their problems. The child never develops financial discipline because they never experience the full consequences of financial irresponsibility. They remain financially immature and dependent because their parents' compassion prevents them from experiencing the discomfort that would motivate behavioral change. This pattern appears everywhere compassionate people interact with those they want to help. The friend who always provides emotional support without requiring the other person to develop emotional regulation skills. The colleague who consistently covers for others' poor performance without allowing them to face the consequences that would motivate improvement. The romantic partner who tolerates disrespectful behavior without setting boundaries that would encourage more respectful treatment. In each case, the compassionate person believes they're helping, but they're actually maintaining the very problems they claim to want to solve. Their help eliminates the natural feedback mechanisms that would encourage others to change, grow, and develop better coping strategies. The psychology of enabling reveals why this pattern is so persistent. The enabled person learns that they don't need to develop internal resources because external resources are always available. They don't need to build problem-solving skills because someone else will solve their problems. They don't need to face their limitations because someone else will compensate for those limitations. Meanwhile, the enabler gets psychological rewards from being needed. Their identity and self-worth become dependent on others' dependence on them. They feel valuable when others need their help and anxious when others become self-sufficient. This creates a perverse incentive for the enabler to maintain others' weakness rather than promote their strength. The enabled person often unconsciously recognizes this dynamic and learns to present their problems in ways that trigger the enabler's compassion while avoiding the discomfort of actually solving those problems. They become skilled at appearing helpless, grateful, and needy in ways that motivate continued help without requiring genuine change or growth. This creates what systems theorists call a complementary dysfunction, a relationship pattern where both parties get psychological needs met through maintaining problematic dynamics rather than resolving them. The enabler gets to feel needed and virtuous, while the enabled person gets to avoid responsibility and consequences. Both benefit from maintaining the dysfunction while pretending to want to resolve it. The enabling dynamic becomes particularly destructive when it operates across generations. Parents who enable their children raise children who expect to be enabled. These children grow up without developing self-reliance, personal responsibility, or distress tolerance, because they've learned that someone else will always manage difficult situations for them. When these enabled children become adults, they seek relationships with other enablers who will continue the pattern. They may choose romantic partners who will rescue them from consequences, employers who will overlook their poor performance, or friends who will always provide support without requiring reciprocity. The enabled person may also become an enabler themselves, but not because they've developed genuine empathy or compassion. They enable others because they've learned that helping behavior earns approval and maintains relationships, not because they've developed authentic caring or the wisdom to help effectively. This creates what sociologists call intergenerational transmission of dysfunction, patterns of enabling and dependency that pass from parents to children to grandchildren, creating family systems where no one develops genuine self-reliance or healthy boundaries. The most tragic aspect of the enabling dynamic is that it prevents people from discovering their actual capabilities. The person who is consistently rescued from challenges never learns what they're capable of handling independently. They develop learned helplessness, not because they're actually helpless, but because their experiences have taught them that someone else will always step in to handle difficulties. Meanwhile, the enabler never learns the difference between helping and harming because they measure their success by others' immediate comfort rather than their long-term development. They feel good when others express gratitude for their help, regardless of whether that help actually improved others' lives or simply maintained their dependency. The enabling pattern also prevents authentic relationships from developing because it creates power imbalances based on need rather than equality based on mutual respect. The enabler feels superior to those they help, while the enabled person feels inferior to those who help them. Neither experiences the satisfaction of genuine mutual partnership where both people contribute value and receive value in balanced exchanges. Breaking the enabling pattern requires the compassionate person to accept that allowing others to face consequences, struggle with challenges, and experience discomfort is often more loving than providing rescue. It requires understanding that true help develops others' capabilities rather than managing their problems, that authentic compassion sometimes requires saying no to requests for assistance, and that sustainable relationships must be based on mutual respect rather than mutual dependency. But this shift requires the enabler to face their own addiction to being needed and to develop sources of meaning and identity that don't depend on others' problems. This can feel threatening because it requires acknowledging that much of what they called compassion was actually serving their own psychological needs rather than others' genuine welfare. True liberation from the chains of compulsive compassion doesn't mean abandoning all care for others or becoming callous and indifferent to suffering. It means developing what we might call strategic compassion, the ability to help others in ways that actually serve their development while preserving your own autonomy and continuing your authentic growth. Strategic compassion begins with recognizing that your first responsibility is to your own psychological and practical development. This isn't selfishness, it's practical necessity. You cannot give what you don't have, and you cannot help others develop capabilities that you haven't developed yourself. Your own strength, wisdom, and capability are the foundation from which any genuine help to others must flow. This requires a fundamental shift in how you evaluate helping opportunities. Instead of automatically saying yes to requests for assistance, you begin asking different questions. Will this help develop the other person's capabilities, or will it enable their continued dependency? Do I have the resources to provide this help without compromising my own essential needs and goals? Is this person taking responsibility for their part in creating and solving their problems, or are they expecting me to solve problems they should handle themselves? Strategic compassion also requires developing what psychologists call emotional boundaries, the ability to care about others' welfare without becoming emotionally consumed by their problems. You can empathize with others' suffering without taking on that suffering as your own responsibility. You can offer support without becoming enmeshed in others' emotional states. This boundary setting often feels uncomfortable initially because it violates the conditioning that taught you to measure your goodness by how much you sacrifice for others. You may feel selfish, uncaring, or guilt-ridden when you decline to help in situations where you previously would have automatically provided assistance. But these uncomfortable feelings are actually signs that you're breaking free from the addiction patterns that kept you trapped in compulsive helping. Just as recovering from any addiction involves withdrawal symptoms, recovering from compassion addiction involves psychological discomfort, as you learn to tolerate others' disappointment and your own guilt without automatically reverting to enabling behaviors. The process requires developing new skills that most compassionate people never learned: how to say no without extensive justification, how to allow others to experience consequences without rescuing them, how to offer emotional support without becoming emotionally responsible for others' states, and how to maintain your own priorities even when others pressure you to change them. One of the most important skills is learning to distinguish between enabling and empowering help. Empowering help develops others' capabilities, provides tools rather than solutions, offers guidance while requiring the other person to take action, and creates increased independence rather than continued dependency. For example, instead of consistently providing money to someone with financial problems, empowering help might involve teaching budgeting skills, helping them develop a plan to increase their income, or connecting them with resources for financial education. The focus shifts from solving their immediate problems to building their long-term capability to solve such problems themselves. Similarly, instead of always providing emotional support to someone going through relationship difficulties, empowering help might involve helping them recognize patterns in their relationship choices, encouraging them to develop emotional regulation skills, or supporting them in setting boundaries rather than simply providing a sympathetic ear that allows them to vent without changing their behavior. This shift from enabling to empowering often reveals how much of your previous helping was actually serving your own psychological needs rather than others' genuine welfare. When you stop providing easy solutions and start requiring others to take responsibility for their problems, you may discover which people were genuinely interested in growth and which were simply seeking someone to manage their lives for them. The people who respond positively to empowering help, who appreciate being encouraged to develop their own capabilities, who take action on guidance provided, who gradually become more self-sufficient. These are relationships worth maintaining and deepening. They represent authentic connections based on mutual growth and respect. The people who respond negatively to the shift from enabling to empowering, who become angry when you stop solving their problems, who accuse you of becoming selfish or uncaring when you set boundaries, who seek other enablers when you refuse to continue the dysfunction. These responses reveal that the relationship was based on your utility rather than genuine care for you as a person. Losing these utility-based relationships can initially feel painful because they may have comprised a significant portion of your social connections. But as you develop strategic compassion and begin attracting people who value mutual empowerment rather than one-sided dependency, you typically find that fewer, higher-quality relationships provide more satisfaction than many dysfunctional ones. Strategic compassion also involves developing what we might call compassionate detachment, the ability to care about outcomes without being attached to controlling those outcomes. You can offer your best guidance, support, and assistance while accepting that others may choose not to use that help effectively. Their choices and their consequences become their responsibility rather than your failure. This detachment prevents you from becoming emotionally hijacked by others' problems while still allowing you to offer genuine care and assistance when appropriate. You can help without becoming enmeshed, care without becoming consumed, and support without becoming responsible for others' lives. Compassion is not a chain you must bear, it's a tool you can choose to use. Your freedom lies not in abandoning all care for others, but in caring for yourself with the same intensity you've shown to others. This is your liberation. This is your power. This is your authentic life, waiting to be lived. The most profound truth about compassion is that it was never meant to be a chain. It was meant to be a choice, a powerful tool that you can use when it serves genuine development and set aside when it would enable dysfunction or compromise your essential growth. Your freedom doesn't require you to stop caring about others. It requires you to care about yourself with the same intensity that you've been caring about others. It demands that you value your own development with the same dedication you've shown to others' welfare. It asks you to choose relationships and activities based on mutual empowerment rather than one-sided sacrifice. The chains of false compassion can only bind you if you continue to mistake them for virtue. Once you see them as the limitations they actually are, once you understand how they've been preventing you from becoming who you're meant to be, once you recognize that authentic service flows from authentic strength, the chains simply fall away. What remains is not callousness or selfishness, but something far more powerful, the freedom to choose when, how, and whom to help. Based on wisdom rather than compulsion, the ability to serve others from a foundation of genuine strength, rather than psychological neediness, and the capacity to create relationships based on mutual respect rather than dependency. You were not born to sacrifice yourself on the altar of others' comfort. You were not designed to live as a servant to others' emotional needs while neglecting your own development. You were not created to mistake your depletion for virtue or your enabling for love. You were born to develop your unique capabilities to their fullest potential, to create value according to your authentic vision, to build relationships that enhance rather than drain your life force, and to offer genuine help from a position of strength rather than weakness. The choice before you is simple. Will you continue wearing the golden chains of compulsive compassion, feeling virtuous about your limitation, while wondering why your life feels empty and your relationships feel draining? Or will you embrace the radical freedom of strategic compassion, choosing when and how to help based on wisdom while prioritizing your own development as the foundation for any meaningful service to others? We have journeyed through the shadow territory of compassion and emerged with a radical understanding. The compassion you were taught to revere as the highest virtue is often nothing more than sophisticated self-imprisonment disguised as moral superiority. The chains you thought were flower garlands, the service you believed was freedom, the sacrifice you imagined was noble. These were the very mechanisms that kept you from discovering your authentic power and living your genuine potential. But this realization is not the end of caring. It's the beginning of authentic care based on wisdom rather than compulsion, strength rather than weakness, choice rather than obligation. When you free yourself from the chains of compassion addiction, you don't become heartless or indifferent. You become capable of genuine compassion that serves others' true development rather than your own psychological needs. The person who has broken free from compulsive compassion discovers something remarkable. They become more valuable to others, not less. When your help comes from overflow rather than depletion, when your care is offered from strength rather than neediness, when your support develops others' capabilities rather than maintaining their dependence, you contribute more to human flourishing than years of self-sacrificial service ever accomplished. This authentic compassion is selective rather than universal, strategic rather than automatic, empowering rather than enabling. You choose whom to help based on their readiness to grow and their willingness to take responsibility for their own development. You offer assistance that builds strength rather than perpetuates weakness. You maintain boundaries that preserve your own resources while maximizing your positive impact. To understand how compassion becomes a chain, we must examine the specific psychological mechanisms that transform a natural human capacity into a compulsive behavior that limits rather than enhances human flourishing. The foundation of compassion addiction lies in what developmental psychologists call codependency, a psychological condition where your emotional well-being becomes dependent on others' emotional states, and your sense of worth becomes tied to your ability to fix, help, or rescue other people. Codependency typically develops in childhood, when children learn that love is conditional on their ability to meet others' emotional needs. The child who gets attention for comforting upset parents, who receives praise for helping struggling siblings, who is valued for being mature and responsible beyond their years, learns that their worth comes from their utility to others. These children grow into adults who automatically scan their environment for opportunities to help, who feel anxious when they're not needed, who interpret others' problems as their responsibility. They've learned to derive their sense of identity and value from being indispensable to others, rather than from developing their own capabilities and pursuing their own goals. The codependent adult doesn't help others because they choose to. They help because they must. Their nervous system has been conditioned to experience distress when others are in distress, regardless of whether that distress is their responsibility or whether their help is actually beneficial. They compulsively involve themselves in others' problems as a way of managing their own anxiety about others' emotional states. This compulsive helping creates what therapists call enabling behavior that appears helpful on the surface, but actually prevents others from developing the capabilities they need to solve their own problems. The codependent person does for others what others should be doing for themselves, not because others can't do it, but because the codependent person needs to do it to feel valuable. The enabled person learns that they don't need to develop problem-solving skills, emotional resilience, or personal responsibility, because someone else will always step in to handle their difficulties. They become dependent on the codependent person's help, which feeds the codependent person's need to be needed, creating a cycle of mutual dysfunction disguised as caring. This dynamic appears everywhere in modern society. The parent who does their teenager's homework doesn't just harm the teenager's academic development, they also reinforce their own sense of being a good parent through their child's dependence. The friend who always provides emotional support without requiring any in return doesn't just enable their friend's emotional immaturity, they also meet their own need to feel wise and generous. The employee who consistently covers for irresponsible colleagues doesn't just enable workplace dysfunction, They also feed their identity as the reliable, selfless team player, the romantic partner who tolerates disrespectful behavior in the name of unconditional love. Doesn't just enable their partner's bad habits, they also maintain their self-image as the patient, understanding, morally superior person in the relationship. Each of these situations involves someone using compassion as a way of meeting their own psychological needs. While telling themselves they're helping others, they're not actually serving others' best interests. They're serving their own need to feel needed, important, and morally elevated through their service. The psychology becomes even more complex when we examine how compassion addiction affects the helper's relationship with their own power and agency. People who organize their lives around helping others often do so because they feel powerless to create the lives they actually want for themselves. It's easier to focus on fixing others' problems than to confront your own limitations. It's simpler to pour energy into others' goals than to develop clarity about your own aspirations. It's more comfortable to sacrifice for others' dreams than to risk pursuing your authentic desires and potentially failing. Compassion becomes a socially acceptable form of avoidance. Instead of doing the difficult work of developing your own capabilities, clarifying your own values, and pursuing your own authentic goals, you can spend all your time and energy helping others with their lives. This feels virtuous rather than avoidant, generous rather than fearful. The compassion addict often has no clear sense of their own wants, needs, or goals because they've spent so much time focused on others' wants, needs, and goals. They know how to read other people's emotional states, but don't know how to identify their own feelings. They're skilled at solving other people's problems, but helpless when it comes to creating the lives they want for themselves. This external focus creates what psychologists call learned helplessness around personal goal achievement. The person who can successfully coach others through relationship problems, career challenges, and personal crises somehow feels incapable of addressing similar challenges in their own life. They've become experts at helping others while remaining perpetually stuck in their own development. The most tragic aspect of this psychology is how it makes people afraid of their own success and power. The compassionate person has learned to associate strength with selfishness and achievement with moral failure. They've been conditioned to believe that focusing on their own development is narcissistic, that pursuing their own goals is greedy, and that creating success for themselves somehow takes away from others. This conditioning keeps them focused on everyone else's welfare while neglecting their own, trapped in a cycle of service that prevents them from ever developing the power and capability that would allow them to serve others more effectively if they chose to do so.